Yeah, so the virtue ethics is, well, at least the way I see it, and I'm really talk about a layman, right? I see it as sort of an application.
As an application?
Yeah, as an application of a theory of morality. Would I be right about that, Ozzy? Would you agree with that?
Um,
It doesn't compete, right? It's sort of how you actually do it, a way to do it.
Well, it's a way to do it because it stresses that morality is a habit. It's the formation that morality concerns itself with the cultivation of a kind of character, and not so much following rules or anything like that. It sort of views moral rules as rough and ready approximations, policy recommendations that will hold and conduce to a good character in a lot of cases, right? It doesn't look for exceptionless, universally applicable rules that you have to heed, right? But it's not just a praxis. It's not just a practice. It's also an entire theory of what constitutes right and wrong. But obviously, you have to have more than just virtue ethics there. You have to also have a theory. You have to have an anthropology. You have to have a theory of human nature, and a theory of mind. It requires a theory of you have to have an entire axiology, a theory of value in there, right? And you have to have an account of normativity, of oughts in general. So, and that doesn't have to come straight out of virtue ethics. That can come out of something else, right? Like, for instance, I have a theory of normativity that is born out of something called speech act theory. Where does our concept of obligation and duty come from? Where the hell does that come from, right? Most people think that obligations and duties, if they're theists, come from God, right? You have duties and obligations to God, right? You are obligated to God, and that's where the concept of duty and obligation comes from. But if you don't posit a God, where the hell do duties and obligations come from, right? You have to have some kind of naturalistic account of where that originates, and that would be a concept that I think doesn't fall out immediately out of the concept of virtue ethics. That you have to import that from somewhere else. You have to have a different theory to shore up that concept. But
tell me what you think about that?
About
also, I'd love to hear, because Nadia is so extreme in the other way. I'd love to hear, Nadia, what you think about moral realism. Oh, she's not here. Anyway, tell me a little bit more about that. So this is brand new to me.
About my theory of normativity? I'd be happy to do that, except that that's a long conversation. Let's see. Do I want to?
Maybe I could do. I could understand a short version.
No, it's not that you couldn't understand a short version. It's that I don't think I can articulate a short version. I'm long-winded at the very best of times. Okay. Let me try this. Okay.
This is one of the more complex issues to explain.
Yeah. Well,
I'm still trying to get a grasp on the basics of it.
Okay. This is. Okay. Okay. There's this concept called normativity. Okay, normativity. We have what are called normative concepts, concepts that are somehow supposed to be regulative. Like when you talk about right and wrong, morally speaking, ought, should, obligation, duty, all of these sorts of concepts. Those are normative concepts. But we have other regulative concepts, normative concepts, like in logic. We have this sense that you ought to reason a certain way, that there's a right way and a wrong way to reason, for instance, right?
Yes.
That too. And so in epistemology, we have regulative or normative concepts, right? So what we want is sort of a concept of, in moral talk, what we want is an account of where normativity, our concept of duty and obligation, comes from. Okay, where does that come from if you're sort of a naturalist, right? And the way I do it is I anchor it in speech act theory. I don't know if anybody here is familiar with speech act theory.
No, that's the thing I hadn't heard of.
Okay, speech act theory is a theory born of the philosophy of language. You'll hear it discussed quite a lot in linguistics as well. Um, it's a theory that was put forward by an English philosopher named John Langshaw Austin. His sort of successor, who articulated it more fully, would be someone like John Searle, contemporary philosopher of mind and language.
Yes. Yes.
People like Ryle, stuff like that. They talk a lot about speech acts. Okay, so, okay, what is speech act theory? It's a theory of language. Okay, and this is going to seem like a long story, but there's a point. It ties to normativity and the concept of duty and obligation. Okay, think of human utterances, speaking. Think of human utterances as actions. Don't think of them as mere.
That's easy for me.
Yeah, don't think of them as mere words.
Yeah.
Think of them like actions. Okay.
Yes. Behaviors.
When you say the cat is on the mat, you performed a speech act. Sorry, my wife's giggling in the background. She's watching Red Dwarf or something like that. When you say the cat is on the mat, you performed what we call a speech act. Mm-hmm. You've made a sound, an utterance, but you've also communicated and tried to communicate a certain propositional content by virtue of making that utterance. Mm-hmm. So that sentence, the cat is on the mat, is what we call a constative sentence. You're stating something, right? You're describing something, right? A state of affairs. Okay, now consider the following sentences. These are in contrast to ordinary constative sentences, like the cat is on the mat, this is a cup, the moon is over there, Consider sentences such as these. I hereby pronounce you man and wife. Mm-hmm. I sentence you to 5 years in jail. You are henceforth banned from the club.
So the first and the third one seem declarative. I don't know what about the second one.
They sound declarative, but there's more to it. Okay, here's a couple more I can think of.
Okay.
Please be advised that the meeting is canceled, or this meeting is adjourned, or I freely confess that on the night of January the 1st, 2012, I robbed a liquor store or something like that. Okay. These are all examples of what are called performative utterances. That is, when you say, I freely confess, this meeting is adjourned, please be advised, I hereby pronounce you, you are henceforth such and such, I sentence you to such and such, right? You're not merely describing a state of affairs, you're actually bringing about the state of affairs.
Yes,
right?
Okay.
If you're a priest in a church during a wedding ceremony, and you say certain words, that brings about the marriage.
Right.
Okay? Other conditions have to abide, but that's one of the necessary conditions, rather.
Okay.
Now the priest isn't merely describing that the two people are married. He declares them to be married. He makes it so by declaring it. And it's the same with sentencing. I hereby sentence you, right? Or when you confess.
Is it like
I freely
ascribing?
confess that. What's that?
Is that ascribing? It's like kind of like you're ascribing something to.
No,
you're making it. You're
I
making
guess
it
that's just a
so with your
label, though,
words.
isn't it?
Right, yeah, you are literally making it so. You're not ascribing. An ascription, I can ascribe something to you. I can ascribe the property of being intelligent or being stubborn or something like that, okay? But something like a confession or a sentencing or a promise, okay? They're called performative utterances within speech act theory, right? They're called performative utterances because they aren't merely constative or descriptive. They are literally actions that bring about the effects that they speak of.
So that wouldn't be declarative. It wouldn't be declarative either. It would be declarative.
They're not merely declarative. They are not merely declarative.
Because of the accompanying action accompanying them. Maybe.
No, they are the action.
The utterance,
I get it.
They are the action.
Right. You aren't married until those words.
I always read more into like the structure. Then I realize that it's not necessarily semantical, but it's a logic structure element instead of like, suppose like I look at it. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I get.
Well, just let me try to get through this because this is actually kind of counterintuitive, right? So like I'm going to ask you to postpone your questions for a little bit. So the idea is that these are literally actions, but using words that bring about the effects that they speak of. You aren't married until the words are uttered. You aren't sentenced until the words "I hereby sentence you" are uttered, right? You haven't confessed until you say "I confess that such and such." Okay. Now this talk of like constative sentences, constative utterances, declarative utterances, performative utterances, which is what I've just been describing these cases, right? This is a sort of standard taxonomy of types of sentences in the philosophy of language and in linguistics. This is nothing sort of controversial. This is just a standard taxonomy. Okay. Now consider a promise. I promise I will be there. When I promise to be there, I'm not merely predicting or expressing a desire to be somewhere. It's a, there's my wife cackling in the background. It's a commissive act, okay? When you promise, you're not just predicting and describing that you're going to be somewhere, you are committing yourself to something, right? That's another species of performative utterance. That's a subspecies of performative utterance. So you have speech acts. Speech acts break down into various types. One of the types of speech act is performative utterances, and I listed a bunch of them before. That's what we were talking about before. And a subspecies of performative utterances a performance utterance is a commissive act, okay, where you commit yourself to something. So when you engage in that kind of performative utterance, when you commit a commissive act in words, right, you are guaranteeing in words that you will be there when you say, "I promise to be there." My utterance entails an obligation by virtue of the utterance, and this is because such an utterance sets up in the other person, provided they speak the language, the expectation that I'm going to be there, come what may. I don't need to say, "Oh, by the way, I promise to honor my obligation to be there." Right? It's enough for me to say, "I promise to be there." I don't have to say, "Oh, and by the way, I also promise to honor my obligation to be there." It's implicit when I say, "I promise to be there," that I have undertaken an obligation to be there. And this last part's important. Now, as it turns out, even constative sentences that seem purely descriptive are partially performative because they too have a commissive component to them. Think back to that first example. Remember when I said the cat is on the mat? When I say the cat is on the mat, that commits me to believing that there's a cat on the mat in ordinary contexts, right? If I say the cat's on the mat, presumably I'm describing that I believe that it is the case that the cat is on the mat. It's as if it comes with a prefix, you know, "I hereby believe that the cat is on the mat," right? So even a purely constative sentence has a commissive dimension to it. You're committed to some proposition, in this case to a belief, right? So built into every sentence, even a purely descriptive one, is a performative element which sets up in another person expectations about you, the utterer of that sentence. So merely by virtue that I say something to you, by virtue that I exploit certain linguistic conventions, right, I set up in you, my listener, certain expectations about my behavior and my beliefs, my dispositions to behave in a certain way in the future, that sort of thing.
Okay.
Now, what you'll notice here is that merely talking to another person engenders countless expectations in another person. Any conversation is going to be immediately, it's going to bring about all these sort of complicated webs of reciprocal expectations in all of the people involved in the conversation. And I see the relevance of that. Consider what happens in usual circumstances of speech, where the usual expectations are bracketed, where they don't apply. Think of when you go see a play. When you're watching a play, you don't hold the actors on the stage to their beliefs about their words and what they imply in real life, right? A wedding scene on a TV soap opera doesn't marry the actors to one another. It marries the characters to one another, right? Acting on a stage, on TV, or if you're recounting a joke, or you're quoting another person even, these are all instances where we just bracket the normal expectations that would otherwise ensue. Okay? And similarly, if I say Bob was at the party and I said I hate Emily, you would not think that I, the utterer, hate Emily when I say Bob hates Emily, right? Or if I say, I heard Bob say I hate Emily, you wouldn't take it to mean that I hate Emily, right? You immediately recognize that when I say the words I hate Emily, prefaced by the words Bob said, that you're to attribute the words I hate Emily to Bob, not to me. So quoting is a case where the standard expectations that would otherwise apply to me are bracketed and applied to Bob, not me. Okay, the speaker of the sentence you're hearing
Okay.
right now. Okay, so I know it sounds tangential, but there's a reason for this. So,
No, I'm sure there is.
okay, in other words, the context of utterance and certain linguistic conventions that we apply determine the usual expectations that are to be bracketed or suspended, or whether they're to be applied, and whether they're to be applied to yourself, the utterer, to another person, and not the speaker. You know, so this business of the context of utterance is critical to expectations, and expectations, as we see, are going to be important to normativity. The context of utterance, right? The context in which you say something, takes us to the issue of what's called indexicality of speech acts. And Helen, I know you know what indexicality means, but for those who don't, an indexical in linguistics and in philosophy of language is a word that points, that indicates. Words like now, here, I, me, you, there, those, this, that, later. Those are all indexical words. Indexical words are words that point, like your index finger points, right? It indicates. So ask yourself, what's the meaning of the word this?
Jump, point, and hex.
What's the meaning of the word this, or the word I, or the word him? What's the referent? Well, if I say, I will meet you there 1 hour from now, that's perfectly meaningful. If I say right now, I'll meet you there 1 hour from now, and I point to where there is, right? You know what it means, right? But if you walk into a classroom and that same sentence is written on a blackboard, right, it's worthless to you. You don't know when it was written. You don't know when the now is in that sentence, right? You don't know where the there is that's referred to. You don't know who the I is that wrote it, and you don't know that the you that it's addressed to is you. It could be some other reader, right? The context of utterance is missing there when you see that written in a blackboard when you walk in, right? Now only has a specific meaning in the context of utterance. You only has a specific meaning in the context of utterance. Later, now, an hour from now, all of these words, these are indexicals, they derive their referent only in the context of utterance, right? So you couldn't be sure that this sentence was addressed to you if you saw it on a blackboard. You just happened to walk into a classroom. You don't know who the I is, you don't know who the you is, you don't know where the there is, you don't know when it was written, so you don't know if an hour from now has already passed or if it's 2 minutes from now. You just don't know, right? You can't make sense of that sentence. You can't use that sentence the way you would.
Are you describing what constitutes the context, like the elements of the context?
I'm explaining
Sort of.
that the context
Linguistically.
of utterance defines the referent whenever you're using indexicals. Certain words like I and here and now and me and you and here and there and this and that.
They're like logical operators almost.
Yeah, that's right. They're like variables that derive their meaning from only in the context of utterance. Now consider the word I. I literally changes a referent every person using it, right? If when I say I, it means Ozzy. When Helena says I, she's meaning Helena, right? Now incidentally, a good way to spot an
Those are
explicit...
dectics.
What's that?
Those are dectics.
Yes, that's right. They're dectic elements,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So
And
I'm just, keep talking. I'm just looking to see if my little behavior book, I'm sorry, just, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. Please continue.
Okay. So now there's something kind of incidental here, but a good way to spot an explicit performative utterance, like a promise or something like that, or some other commissive act, is to look for indexicals. Promises and commissive acts, they're usually filled with indexicals. I now pronounce you, husband and wife. I hereby, with these words, sentence you to, I, on this date, freely confess that, they're filled with indexicals, right? So we're all familiar with explicit performatives and commissives, and we identify them easily by spotting them using those indexical terms. We don't realize we're doing this, but we all sort of natively do this, right? And every sentence has this performative or commissive dimension. So legal documents and affidavits and sworn testimonies, etc., they're usually littered with indexicals. They're dated, they're witnessed, they're signed, and there's all kinds of references to time and place and stuff like that to make it obvious that what is being performed and who is being affected and when things will take effect, etc., is all explicit, right? I hereby testify, I confess, the undersigned hereafter swear that such and such, right? The point here is that even a statement, though, that seems like a purely constative or descriptive statement is also performative and commissive. It's not just the I hereby promise or I swear or I pronounce you man and wife. It's not just the explicit performatives that are performatives. Constative sentences are also performative and commissive. The sentence, the cat is on the mat, is just saying, I, Ozzy, now, with these very words, hereby imparting to you that it is my belief that there is a cat and it's on a mat. Okay.
So what? So go on.
Okay. So well, in that sense, every statement is a commissive act, right? It's everything is like a promise, because we know that such an utterance has to set up certain expectations in the other person about us and our future content, right? Our immediate content or much more distant conduct, right? So you just need to contrast this with cases of like saying things on the stage to see how the force of this, right? In cases where we bracket the normal expectations, you can see that it's different, right? Now, notice that we don't have to invoke some outside metaphysical principle or being for why or how we enter into these obligations. The obligations are a consequence of our very actions. By virtue that we set out to communicate ideas to other people, by virtue of exploiting certain linguistic conventions, right, speech acts, right, but not limited only to those, we involve ourselves in these complex webs of obligations. Those obligations are constituted by the predictable expectations that we instill in other people whenever we exploit those linguistic conventions through speech acts. We don't require a rule that says, you must obey the rule that says X in order to incur an obligation. You don't need something that to obligate you. You incur obligations because you are a social animal with enough behavioral plasticity and intelligence to deliberately and even tacitly communicate information to another by virtue of your actions, your speech acts, okay, but not limited to your speech acts. Now, there's an interesting thing that happens often in ordinary discourse that sort of shines a light on this, okay? Think of the cases where you demand clarification on what a person means, okay? Well, here's a little thought experiment. Suppose we both like a certain band, Helena, and that band is going to be performing in our town, and I say, hey, Helena, I'm going to go buy tickets. Do you want to go to the show too? Now, this utterance commits me to holding certain beliefs and a certain course of action in your mind. Right? I've set up expectations in your mind, and I know what they are. Indeed, I deliberately said what I said, uttered what I uttered, used the speech act that I did in order to set up those expectations in you. That's the point of communication. It's a setting up of expectations, right, in my listeners by virtue of what I say. But there's some ambiguity in that utterance when I say, hey, I'm going to buy tickets. Do you want to go to the show too? Okay. Am I offering to purchase a ticket for you? Right? Is this a date, or am I just saying I'm going to buy one for myself, and I'm asking you if you intend to buy one for yourself too? You know, hey, I'm going to buy tickets. Do you want to go to the show too? Am I expecting you to, buy your own ticket, right?
How do people deal with that ambiguity?
Well, they ask follow-up questions.
They ask for clarification.
Right. So you would ask for clarification, and if I reply, oh, I'll get a ticket for you, that's a commissive act. It's not an explicit promise. I didn't say, I, Ozzy, hereby promise and swear that I shall buy you a ticket. No, I just said, I'll get you a ticket. That's a commissive act. I've committed myself. I've incurred an obligation, right? It's not an explicit promise. It's implicit. It sounds like I'm merely describing a state of affairs of what will happen, but it's a commissive act, right? I'm not merely describing or predicting what I think will happen. I've committed to buying you that ticket. Now, that last utterance, right, I will get you a ticket, is not implicit in the sense that I said more than I meant to say. It's just implicit in the sense that I didn't use the formal convention of saying, I hereby promise that I shall buy you a ticket, right? Now, when would you ever resort to using the more formal convention, right? Well, you might doubt that I'll do it, right? Because, you have a poor record of paying back money, let's say, Helen. Supposing you're deadbeat, you don't pay back money or something, right? And I fear that, and you fear that I won't buy one for you, right? You might, or maybe I tend to lie about what I'm going to do, right? Then we might want to sort of say, you're going to buy the ticket? Yeah, I'm going to buy the ticket. You promise to buy the ticket? Yeah, I promise to buy the ticket, right? The degree and extent of formality that we insist upon in these commissive acts is very context dependent, depends on what you know about the person and their previous history and that sort of thing. So you might contrive to make me utter the explicit formulation of that speech act. You might try to sort of force me into actually explicitly promising, right?
Right.
To make it salient to me what the
Right.
hell I'm committing myself to, right?
Right.
Doing
Yeah.
that ensures that I know that I've committed myself, right? You're reminding me that I committed myself, right? That I know that you know what I'm committed to, right? But the commitment is just more salient, right? It's not more, I'm not more committed. It's just more salient, right? You needn't use an explicit formulation to bind yourself to a course of action, right? Those formal conventions are not required in ordinary commissive acts, right? So what you can see here is that you don't need some metaphysical reason to honor your words. There's no rule that says that we're trying to obey, except the principle that says, if you wish to communicate X to a person, use these words. You just make use of a certain linguistic convention, right? Our very moral obligations to one another are founded upon our very capacity to communicate. There's no extra linguistic reason why you should do what you say you'll do, right? Such a rule would just be surplus to requirements, right?
Yes.
Communication is about setting up expectations.
Okay.
Obligations are constituted out of those expectations. Languages are, among other things, conventions by which we specify or express and set up expectations about our mental states and our dispositions to behave in certain ways in the minds of other people.
Right, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be language. It's just a purposeful communication.
That's right. I mean, it can be gestural. It can be.
Yes.
There's all kinds of things, right? I mean, when
Right, because you can see it in other higher mammals that don't have language per se.
It's not restricted to us, right?
Yes.
So, and by the way, notice that you don't need to postulate a metaphysical surveillance system like God or karma to explain why we don't like liars and why we don't like promise breakers, right? We don't like it because such violators are using a medium of communication to deliberately miscommunicate. They are deliberately setting up the wrong goddamn expectations.
You know what just came to mind?
Traffic markers on the highway, right?
Yeah. You know what just came to mind for me is the McGurk effect.
I don't know what that is.
That's where you go fa or ba.
Oh yeah, right, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Cortex overrides your visual cortex overrides what
That's
you hear.
really that's a fascinating little issue there.
It is within this context. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, but so let's get to the finale.
Okay. So now, at some point, someone's going to be inclined to ask, well, what the hell is wrong with setting up the wrong expectations in people? What the hell is wrong with that?
Okay.
Well, just remind yourself of what the hell words are actually for, and why you dislike having the wrong expectations set up in you by another person's words. Note how if you have a friend or an acquaintance who lies to you on a regular basis, or is otherwise unreliable about what they say they're going to do, or something like that, or what they say has happened, right? You'll find yourself manipulating your friend into uttering all sorts of explicit performatives. You're going to be there, right? You understand that I'll be waiting for you, right? You're not just going to forget to pick me up, right?
Yeah.
In short, the normative character of obligations stems from expectations that are set up using linguistic and other social conventions. It is, to put it strongly, a condition of intelligibility that people must mean what they say. We literally could not understand one another. Your fan is going in. We literally could not understand one another and predict one another's actions, nor get people to behave in the ways that we need and want them to, if too many of our utterances were not sincere. You can't even get as far as lying or deceiving a person without exploiting a linguistic convention and expectations that constitute the permissive conditions of linguistic intelligibility, right? I mean, it has to be the case that most people are telling the truth most of the time for you to get away with lying. It's just like if every bill in your economy was a fake and a counterfeit, someone comes up with the so-called real one, you wouldn't trust it, right? So the ability to lie and to deceive and to defraud people is parasitic upon ordinary expectations of sincerity in what people say. That's why we hate liars and promise breakers, right? It's not because there's a rule that says you must not do it, right? The rule that says you must not do it comes out of what I just described, not the other way around. Now, social contract theory, I think, in my view, gets everything backwards, right? The very notion of a contract is itself just a formal, explicit, conventional formulation. Contracts stem from linguistic conventions, not the other way around, right? A contract is just a special, formal case of ordinary linguistic requirements.
But I think that a social contract theorist would agree to that.
Yeah.
They may not know all that background, but I don't think that they're deliberately saying that in fact it is the reverse.
Well, no, but a social contract theorist tries to understand the concept of obligation in terms of a contract, right? But the point, but it's the linguistic requirements that ground our very notion of obligation and duty, including the obligation to honor a contract. Social contract theory doesn't give you a reason to honor the damn contract.
Yeah, why are you obligated to honor the contract?
Right. Whereas I think
Because it's a contract? No.
rather than you have to have a reason to honor the contract, and I think I've given you a reason to why we honor contracts and why you people. It's a condition of intelligibility, of communication, that we mean what we say. Honesty and sincerity are required for communication. That's why we like truth tellers, and why we don't like liars, and why we don't like oath breakers and promise breakers and defrauders and such, right? It's not just that it's uncomfortable, it's that communication isn't even possible, right? So what I've described would be what undergirds social contract. Social contract theory doesn't and can't explain why one ought to honor the social contract that one is a part of, right? So the idea of conditions of intelligibility here just refers to the sorts of behavioral permissive conditions that allow or make it possible for an epistemic or a linguistic community to reliably predict a person's actions and mental states, their beliefs and their desires and intentions. And now notice, you don't need any specific language for any of this, or any language at all. Language just makes it possible to communicate and set up very specific, fine-grained expectations. But
right, specific and more complicated ones.
Right,
yeah.
We can and see similar expectations arising in the behavior of great apes, for instance, right? Apes can lie to one another, and they do. Actually, there's some fascinating ethology on this.
I mean, you can even see it in chickens if you know what you're looking for.
Yeah, I'm not familiar in the case of chickens, but I know in other apes it's true. Elephants, I'm not familiar with chickens, but I'll take you at your word there.
Yeah.
Now apes, because they're not as smart, they don't have the linguistic capacities that we have. So they lack the higher degree of behavioral plasticity that we have. They can't communicate or impart and engender as many sorts of precise expectations in their fellows. There's less that they can lie about.
Yes.
There's less that they can express. So there's
Right.
less for them to lie about, right? And less that they can tell the truth about. They lack that behavioral plasticity intelligence to conceive of, much less articulate, these very fine-grained distinctions. Now, one negative result of all this is that we humans, by virtue of our intelligence and our language, can screw one another over. Right, we can game the system. We can screw one another over in like vastly more ways than apes can. We can set up more expectations and then violate them than any ape could, right?
Yeah.
Now notice also that you don't have to postulate a separate moral sense, a conscience or some magical moral compass in your head for why we think this is wrong, right? We just need to have a capacity to form expectations of the actions and beliefs of others, coupled with a desire to be able to rely on them, right? And I mean, you just have to be able to rely on these other things in order to have trust, in order to sort of cooperate and sort of enjoy life, right? So
could there be special classes like where people make like indirect innuendo using the same kind of semantical structures, or not semantical, but
well, there's something called indirect speech acts. We do that all the time, where we communicate.
Yeah, like flirting.
Completely indirect. Yeah, exactly. You don't always have to say. I mean, a lot of language, most of language, is probably is implicit, right? You don't have to always state exactly, formally and explicitly things. You can just so much can be implied, right? That all of flirting is implied, and double entendre works the same way. But so what I'm trying to get to the gist here, Helena. I know you're getting impatient. So what we have here is a thoroughly naturalistic and non-metaphysical account of the concept of obligation and duty. It has nothing to do with social contracts. or being duty-bound by some metaphysical being who gives us marching orders or anything like that. And the theory has the virtue of being utterly realistic, as I see it, in the sense that it posits no dubious entities or principles and violates no observations of human interactions that I'm aware of, right? So using speech act theory, you can ground and explain why we value or prize certain things as virtues, such as honesty, integrity, rational consistency, right? Following through on promises. All of those are the grounding of our concept of obligation. And from there, we can extrapolate further obligations by means of explicit formalized contracts and explicit promises and obligations, right? So there's no question of why you ought to... Go ahead.
That's the answer to the sort of, you know, the virtues chosen in virtue ethics are arbitrary. That's the answer to that.
Right, right. They're not. There's nothing arbitrary about them. Intelligibility and communication rests upon it, right? Mm-hmm. So there's no question of why you ought to honor your obligations. To ask the question, why should I honor my obligation, is to ask, why should I behave as if I mean what I say? I literally cannot take seriously what you say unless I assume you mean what you appear to mean by virtue of the words and actions and what they imply about what you believe. If you say something to me, you're exploiting a linguistic convention. I can only operate on what you say and act on what you say if I take you to be satisfying a certain condition of sincerity. And this is, by the way, is what's wrong with every species of social contract, as I understand it. All social contract theory fails to explain why we should honor our contracts in the first place. I think it has to be understood the other way around, right? So, now in some respects this sounds like a super pragmatic theory, right? But it's not the sort of pragmatism that involves merely looking out for one's own self-interest, but rather it's the deeper sort of pragmatism that recognizes that you couldn't even get as far as lying if you wanted to save your ass, unless you recognize the necessity that most of our speech acts have to be true for lies even to work. And precisely because the system doesn't require perfect honesty, I mean, we factor into our reasoning the likelihood that a person has ulterior motives and so might be motivated to lie, right? Ask yourself how everyone treats an occasional self-interested liar, right? Ask yourself what your moral intuitions are regarding what white lies and lies uttered to save someone from peril. We make exceptions. We understand, right? Mm-hmm. But we don't feel that way about habitual liars, right?
Right.
You know, someone who's a very effective habitual liar, right? We don't trust them. No, there's some people who lead entire double lives and are never uncovered, right? If they were discovered to be lying, we'd be furious with them, even if we never discover them to be lying, right? We would be, right? Counterfactual, we would be, right? So this is a theory that supports exactly the sort of counterfactuals that it needs to support, right? It can't be a condition of adequacy on any account of moral normativity that a guarantee that every misdeed is spotted and punished. It just has to be the case that if you were to spot it, you would want to punish it, right? So this account also...
Is there no expectation for lying in certain circumstances?
Yes, there are. I just maybe like where it would save someone's life, for instance, or where you might spare someone's feelings and there would be no harmful consequences. There would only be the benefit of sparing someone's feelings. We fully expect people to lie, and I would say in those cases it's even obligatory to lie.
Exactly.
Right. Now, this account also explains why we despise the people who lie and cheat and mislead and break promises and violate contracts, right? And it does so without having to claim, I hate liars because they're breaking a moral rule. It's not because they're breaking a moral rule. We have the moral rule because they're violating a linguistic convention that makes communication possible, right? Those people are like the people who go on the highway and change the traffic signs and the lights and stuff like that. They make movement and safe commerce and travel impossible. Right?
Is it the same as violating of expectations?
Yes, they are. They're violating. They are violating your expectations. By violating your expectations, by exploiting cynically a linguistic convention that trades on sincerity. Right on. They undermine the capacity for communication. That's why we value this, right? So we have to be careful what we infer from this, though. Like this is supposed to be an account of the normative dimension of morality, an account of why we have and all believe in a concept of moral duty and obligation, right? And where those come from. It comes from these expectations.
Isn't there a factor in all this beyond linguistics and just in treading in the realms of philosophy?
Well, yes, this is all philosophy of language. Speech act theory comes out of the philosophy of language. It's used in law, for instance. Yeah, this comes out of the work of a philosopher, 20th century philosopher named John Langshaw Austin, who wrote about speech acts. If anyone's interested in speech act theory, I recommend a book by John Searle called Speech Acts. It's very good.
Oh, I put up one in the sidebar there from this gentleman. So I hit the right person when I found that?
Yeah, okay, yeah. In the sidebar is one of my favorite works of philosophy of all time. It's by
really?
J.L. Austin. It's called How to Do Things with Words. It's a series of lectures, the William James lectures, and it's a very short little book. It's a series of lectures that he delivered over the course of a few nights.
Isn't that funny? I zeroed in on that right away.
Well,
so that's what I should read. Thank you.
If you Google speech act theory, it's one of the first books you'll hit. Right? It's like one of the best sources anyway on the subject, and it's one of those sort of mind-expanding little reads. And you can read it in a couple of sittings because there's just a few lectures.
Well, I mean, like, what I thought was interesting is when you were talking about the great apes. I had watched something somewhere, I can't remember where, but all these great apes that we had taught, hand signs to, they've never demonstrated asking a question.
That's not true.
Yeah,
they do ask questions.
Yeah, they don't usually have a formal method of asking a question, but usually from the context it's clear that they are interrogating, that they're looking for information. I know that there were some studies that were done with a kind of electronic panel that you could push button, and there was a way of representing that you were asking a question, an interrogative, there. So to the extent that that was the use of language, and that's questionable.
Well, I mean, like, I guess what they were talking about was in the context of the question, why?
That's a different thing.
Yeah, that's
a different thing, right? Yeah, so that's a way more abstract kind of thing. So I guess I would agree with you there.
Yeah,
but they definitely ask, I mean, not only questions, but even sort of have a generative language. At least there's a couple of instances of where you could describe it as a generative, where they make up their own words out of combinations of words that they know that approximate sort of what they're trying to point at, right? Like neck ring instead of collar, stuff like that.
Right.
Well, but I mean, why do you think they haven't been able to extrapolate thought to ask why? I guess my question is.
Well, they might simply not have the cognitive capacity. It might not be something that you learn. It might be something that you're born with, right? Just like we have the capacity to walk upright. We don't have to teach our children to walk upright. They're not going to sort of crawl indefinitely or be knuckle walkers or something like that. We just, wired that at a certain stage of development we simply have that capacity, right? I mean, here, let me give you an example of this, right, of how sort of wired in this language can be, right? A lot of people think that words are just names for things, right? That all language is just a word is just a name for a thing, right? Like a cup, the word cup names a cup, and the word computer names computer, right? But ask yourself, like when you're talking to a small child, or when a small child is sort of picking up a language, right? How does it know that you're naming something? Right? I mean, if I say, I hold up a cup in front of my child and I say cup, 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 and I repeat it, trying to get the child to associate this object with the word cup. How does the child know that I'm playing the naming game? That what I'm doing is naming something, as opposed to asking something, as opposed to giving an order. I could be giving an order.
On what Plato was getting at, where I think it was Plato. I can't remember. Plato, excuse me. Where you don't need to be shown every single rock on the face of the earth to extrapolate that one rock is the same as all other rocks.
Yeah, that's true.
It's slightly different.
That has to do with generalization.
This is the contextual basis in which the person receiving the communication interprets.
Well, it's really interesting because when you're dealing with like infants who have autism, very often they can't do that. They don't know that you're labeling something.
Right.
And you have to teach them how to know what the implications are before you really can get into. Otherwise, you end up having to directly teach all these different functions. So if we're just talking about labeling a noun, right? To teach, you have to what seems to come naturally to neurotypicals, even infants, where it's obvious that mom's labeling something versus mom's not asking me if I want it. Those things you have to teach with a lot of infants who have autism. I just think that's sort of an aside. But anyway, you were saying, how does one know this, and where were you going with that?
Oh well, I was just sort of making the case of what you talked about, a function. We don't realize, we're so used to thinking of words as names for things that we think that's the only function of words. But words are not just names for things, right? We do things with words. That's why that word. Even just obvious labels are not just names for things. That's right. Well, consider something like this. Here's a classic example, right, from Wittgenstein. What is the meaning of the word "this"? What does this refer to? Well, this refers to whatever the hell I'm pointing at while I'm saying the word "this," right? Just like the word "I" refers to whoever is saying "I" when they're saying the word "I."
Is that like a connotation?
No, well, those are examples of indexicals, right? Those are indexical words, right? They point. Okay, so
their meaning changes depending on who's speaking.
That's right. Who's speaking and the context of utterance. Like, where is here? Well, here is wherever the person saying here is when they say the word here. That's where here is. Yep. Where is there? Where there is wherever the hell the person is pointing to or looking at or talking about and referred to in some other way earlier in the sentence or later in the sentence when they say the word there.
Well, it's really interesting. Neurotypicals pick this up. Yeah, you don't have to teach any of this.
Right.
To neurotypical.
Right.
But just this dectic stuff and this indexical stuff is one of the hardest things among the basic things that you have to teach somebody who's having a language problem. A baby.
This stuff is so basic to us. It comes so naturally to us. We don't realize that we're doing something.
Well, so it's incredible. People don't even realize that it's there.
That's
One
right.
of the first hurdles is just showing people that's there and how complex that really is.
Yeah, it's complicated. If I say the word, if I walk up to you and I go, "Quatlu," did I just warn you? Did I just scold you? Did I just name something obvious that you should? Did I just play the name game? Did I just name something that I wanted you to emphatically know in that moment? Or did I just scold you? Did I just chastise you? Did I just implore you? Did I order you? Like you don't know just from that word, right? But the point is, your mind is capable of picking up just from linguistic utterances and the behavior of your fellow species around you. You're able to figure out a child who doesn't yet speak a language is able to figure out that was an order. That sentence, that was an order. That sentence was an instruction. That sentence was a question. That sentence was a promise. That sentence was a description. Yeah. How the hell do children have these conceptual categories already in place?
Is that like a modal connective or like a modal operator?
Well, a modal operator would be another sort of conceptual category, right? Conceptual categories like possibility and necessity and stuff like that. But it's not like that. That would be an example of this. But the idea is a human brain, as it's developing, develops these conceptual categories, these linguistic categories, to take sentences and say this sentence is naming, this sentence is describing, this sentence is ordering, this sentence is promising, this sentence is asking, right? This sentence is beseeching, this sentence is praying, right? Mm-hmm. This sentence is promising, right? Mm-hmm. All these are all linguistic games that we play. You never teach a child, okay, little Johnny, now we're going to talk about what it means to ask. This is what asking is.
You don't teach neurotypical children that.
Exactly. You don't teach neurotypical children. Exactly.
But it doesn't mean that it's not learned.
That's right. No, that doesn't mean that it's not learned. But what it means is that there has to be some kind of neurophysiology in place that has that capacity. Yeah.
So are these modal operators in the sense that they can be alethic or whatever, deontic, axiological, epistemic or whatever?
They're not modal operators. No, they're not. No, I mean those the alethic modalities and the deontic modalities. I mean, for those who don't know, things like necessity, possibility, those are sort of alethic modalities. These are bits of our language that we typically use in language and stuff, and in logic and things like that, where these are other little sort of less obvious subcategories. Okay.
Of what you're referring. Okay.
Of what I'm referring to. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
So
okay.
yours is the global operator. You're talking about a global operator framework that these come out of.
Yeah, don't think in terms of computers. This is not going to help, actually. Like if you sort of liken it to computers, you're going to end up going down the wrong path here. But I wonder if I could just sort of finish up the very last point that I wanted to make about the whole normativity thing and expectations and obligations of speech act theory, because sort of there was a kind of take-home message I wanted to get there. And like, remember I said that we've got to be careful what we infer about this, right? Like this. What I was providing was an account of the normative dimension of morality, right? It's supposed to be an account of why we have and why we all believe in a concept of moral duty and obligation, right? What the account that I was giving in terms of speech act theory is it's striving to explain how the moral uses of ought and should and must gets into our moral talk, why it has the flavor that it does. Right, to make it more than a mere hypothetical imperative. It's an attempt to explain the oughtness of our moral talk in terms of conditions of intelligibility, where the sentient beings who are interacting are concerned. Right? It's not a recipe or a formula for knowing which moral claims happen to be true and which ones happen to be false. It's not a decision procedure that I've provided here. Right? That, as they say, is a whole other chapter. Right? Another thing is to notice is that this theory, it can only be applied to where the interactions of sentient beings, where you have interactions of sentient beings who possess interests are concerned, right? It's wholly inapplicable to animals that can't deliberate, right? Or to inanimate objects. There's no worry that from this theory we might discover that we have a duty to care about rocks or something like that, right? Because rocks don't have interests and stuff, right? So the sort of I guess the take-home message here is that this is a purely naturalistic account of where our concept of duty and obligation originates from. Why do we even have such a concept? I think it bubbles up out of the kinds of creatures that we are, namely linguistic using creatures. The capacity to communicate rests upon our capacity to set up expectations in other people. That's why we think people have obligations to us and why we think we have obligations to other people. That's where duty and obligation comes from. That's the genesis of why we have that concept in the first place. That would be my account. Am I still on here?
Yeah, that sucked. I'll have to rewind and watch it later. I missed the end of it. My bloody pasta burned on this.
Ozymandias, you've blown my mind with all this. Like, I've never really considered any of this.
I want to hear what Nadia has to say.
Oh, well, it seems like it's driving a space from a sort of I don't know, as a emergent sort of property of a sort of egoistic system in which you have atomized egoistic actors communicating amongst each other. Is it right that it's deriving ultimately from a sort of egoism?
I think of it as more fundamentally social, actually. I don't think of it as sort of atomized egos, but I mean, I think you can look at it that way. Yeah, I tend not to think of it that way. I tend to think of us as being herd animals that come with pro-social instincts and pro-social emotions, and also some antisocial instincts and antisocial emotions. But there's nothing egotistical and selfish about this, right? Communication, I think, is, of course, we communicate with people because we have interests that we want to serve, our own interests. But our interests are not limited to our own narrow selfish interests. When I talk about our interests, I'm not talking about just me, myself, and I. I mean, our interests can extend to other people. Even at the very bottom level, I'm not someone who thinks that ultimately my concern for other people rests on how good it makes me feel or something like that. I think that altruism can and does go all the way down.
How do you
And-
think that plays out with things like the selfish gene, like in terms of
Well, the selfish gene, I mean, that's a metaphor. Right?
different
I mean,
thing?
Yeah,
Oh,
when
I
he talks-
understand that.
Yeah, when Dawkins talks about the selfish gene, he's not saying that genes have any feelings and that they feel selfish or that the genes are looking out for themselves. He just means that you have to adopt for explanatory purposes of understanding why things like altruism and mutualism and reciprocity and all the complex pro-social emotions and instincts and behaviors arise. You have to ultimately understand those at the level of the gene and what serves the interests of the replication of the genes. Because if it didn't serve the interests of gene replication and propagation and differential reproductive success, ultimately one would not expect to find those things, right? But as it turns out, mutualism, reciprocity, altruism, these are great ways of getting your genes propagated. Right? There's cooperation is one of the sort of nature's most ingenious ways of getting your genes into the next generation. Right? There's nothing sort of. A lot of people think that Darwinian theory sort of predicts that we should all be selfish and egotistical, and that's absolutely not true.
Isn't it like a game theory thing though, where the altruism hinges on the pretense that it serves oneself?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in game theory, there are strategies where clearly being Machiavellian and pretending to be altruistic will advance you, right? That's why people pretend to be altruistic.
Yeah, but it's not genuine though. Then by definition, it's not altruism.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that the genuine thing doesn't work. The genuine thing does work. The reason you would lie and pretend to be altruistic, and the reason you would lie and pretend to be honest and virtuous and cooperative and trustworthy and all that, is precisely because everyone knows that the real thing is a good thing, right? That it actually works, right? If it didn't work, you wouldn't value it and you wouldn't lie. You wouldn't pretend to be an honest person, a trustworthy person, a cooperative person, a generous, charitable, altruistic person. You wouldn't pretend to be those things if everyone didn't value them already. It's precisely because they do have a value that we value them, and that it's in the interest of some people to game the system.
Wow, right? I wonder how that plays out.
It's just like counterfeit money. Counterfeit money doesn't work unless there's real money.
I wonder how much of self-image we build that way, like from emotional drivers that are kind of built on a framework like that.
You wonder how self-what?
Just like, within one's own mind, how we project our own being to other persons, and how we leverage that in sort of a similar manner. I don't know.
I mean, like, how does this conflate with the rise of individualism in let's say the last 400 years, right? The idea of individual rights, the idea of especially in the United States, and in large parts of Europe, and in Japan, even, for crying out loud, where people ultimately see themselves as individuals and then part of a collective, rather than part of a collective. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I see what you're getting at. I think that question is sort of orthogonal. It runs completely at 90 degrees, independently of of what I was describing. It's an important question. I think that it's important to have social glue, and a culture that too strongly emphasizes individualism and individual autonomy at the expense of concern for the welfare of others and some kind of collectivism. If there's just too much of that, then that, I think, is detrimental to society.
Has that ever happened, though? Has there ever been too much of that?
Well,
I
would argue there's a little too much of it right now in
really?
Western culture. Yeah, I think that we suffer from a lot of anomie and some kind of cultural malaise because people are incredibly self-absorbed and self-indulgent and think themselves too autonomous and are a little too unconcerned with other people.
Do you think social networks perhaps reinforce this? Like things like Facebook and the kind of things we're doing now? Like,
Well, I think if we had a different culture, Facebook would work very differently and would serve different ends. I mean, people usually just use Facebook to brag about themselves, to make themselves seem happier and leading more.
That's what I'm trying to suggest.
I mean, yeah. Facebook, I think, especially is used more to either advocate and agitate for certain causes and interests that people have, or else, more generally, though, it's used to for the presentation of self. You're presenting yourself a certain way. This is how I would like to be seen, right? I mean, I got rid of my own private Facebook account and created a Facebook account.
That was your way to protest against it?
No, I found myself doing that. I found myself creating a persona, and I realized it was a little bit too artificial, and I wasn't doing it self-consciously. I just, by my choices of what I chose to put out there and what I chose not to put out there, I didn't like it, and I started feeling a little bit more kind of fakey. And so what I did was I said, okay, well, I have this other interest. I'm interested in the Great Debate, and I have this YouTube channel, Ozymandias, and why don't I just create a Facebook page there using that name where I just talk and agitate about kinds of things that concern me in the Great Debate.
Well, I think that many that get a large viewership or something on YouTube that have such stuff have to make that separation between IRL and their own self because of just, let's face it, there's a lot of crazies out there.
Well, I mean, like in terms of YouTube, once you get to a certain size, I don't know the magic number, right? But you become kind of an institution rather than a person.
Yeah, you sort of transcend, what your own stuff is, and then you get these sycophants that sort of encircle this banner or whatever. I see that happening with like, the Gamergate stuff and all that.
Well, like one
like
YouTuber
MRA
I watch,
versus feminism shit.
One YouTuber I watch religiously, and I have for a long time now, that I saw this happen to, was Sargon of Akkad, actually. He went from, like, when I subscribed to him, I think he had maybe 5,000 subscribers, right? And he's at almost 200,000. And when he talks about having a large channel, when you take the Sargon of 5,000 subs versus the Sargon at 200,000 subs, you're talking about two completely different individuals, like in terms of a persona. Yeah, it's the same guy doing the same videos over and over again, but the channel Sargon of Akkad had outgrown the person Sargon of Akkad. You see what I'm getting at?
It's an interesting, I don't want to label it a phenomenon, but it's an interesting social dynamic playing out. I know this Iron Skeptic or something like that would be probably similar. Maybe, I don't know.
Armored Skeptic, yeah, he just had like his over 100,000 or so.
Wow.
Yeah, that guy took off huge.
Yeah, his latest video was him getting his plaque.
So
Oh wow!
we lose Ozzy,
Got his YouTube plaque.
Before we lose Ozzy, Nadia, I would like to know what you think about moral realism, if you're familiar with it already.
Moral realism? Yeah, I hold a moral realism.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Okay, well, I guess on that note of accord, I should get that very rare note of accord on moral questions. I'm gonna go.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyway, thank you all for letting me prattle on. I know that was like a really long discourse. No, I mean
It was much more enjoyable than another.
I want to know about your metaphysical position on. Let me think of something.
Hurry! He's on his way out.
I have nothing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, geez, man, you wrote a check you couldn't cash there.
Oh no, I could. I could. I'm not going to.
Okay. Well, I've got to go anyway. Thank you very much for your patience. That was very kind of you all. Anyway, and Helen, thanks for the questions. It's really nice.
Well, I'm still thinking about it.
Okay.
I'm still gonna pwn you someday.
Feel free. You have a standing invite. Hit me up for a hangout. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ozzy. It was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you.
Thanks, Ozzy.
Nice to meet you, Melissa. Bye bye.
Have a good night.
Goodbye.
Good night.